The night the storm came in from the sea, the sky turned the color of iron, and the waves battered the cliffs until the air itself seemed to shake. I had gone out to secure the shutters on the old estate when I saw them on the road, 3 figures moving against the wind, coats plastered to their backs, suitcases dragging behind them through the mud. They looked like ghosts, shadows that the storm had spat out. I almost turned away. Strangers meant trouble, and I had enough of that already. But then one of them stumbled, and something about the way she reached for the other 2, without thinking, without words, made me move toward them. They were half drowned, half frozen, but still standing. I brought them inside. The hole smelled of dust and salt and old wood. They left small puddles wherever they stood, their shoes ruined, their faces hollow from the kind of exhaustion that no rest could immediately cure. The one who spoke first had a quiet, deliberate tone. She said they needed somewhere to stay just for a while. I could see in her eyes that a while meant until the world stopped chasing them. They told me little, but I understood enough. One had signed her name on a loan for her brother, and he had disappeared with the money. Another had trusted the wrong man in business. The third had no story she was ready to share, just silence that carried its own kind of weight. I had the space, and I'd been living alone long enough to forget what human voices sounded like in the evening. So I told them they could stay, if they helped around the property, if they worked for what they needed. The estate had been my father's, a place built for more people than one man could fill. Since his passing, I'd let it rot in quiet neglect. The pipes rattled, the roof leaked, and the garden had gone wild. I thought they might be a nuisance. Instead, they seemed to belong there more quickly than I ever had. That night, the storm broke one of the windows in the east wing. We worked together to cover it, using boards from the shed and nails I hadn't touched in years. The 3 of them moved without hesitation, soaked hair sticking to their cheeks, hands trembling but steady in purpose. When we finally stopped, cold and breathing hard, the youngest laughed, just once, a thin, startled sound. Then the others laughed too. The house echoed with it, filling the cracks between walls and memories. For a moment, I could almost believe the place was alive again. When I went to bed, the storm still roared outside, but it no longer felt like something trying to break in. It felt like something being driven away. I didn't know what I had taken into my home that night, only that they carried more than debts, and somehow I already owed them something I couldn't yet name. Morning began with the pale light slipping through the patched window, turning the dust in the air into drifting gold. The storm had passed, leaving the ground soaked and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. When I stepped into the kitchen, they were already awake. One was boiling water over the old stove, another was sweeping, and the third sat at the table mending a torn sleeve with thread so thin it looked like spider silk. They didn't wait for instruction. They moved like people who had learned not to waste time waiting for permission to survive. I found myself watching more than speaking. There was rhythm in the way they worked, careful, deliberate, as though order itself was a kind of prayer. By the 3rd day, the old house began to change. The leaks were sealed, the floors swept clean of years of dust. The orchard, long overgrown, started to show color again under their care. One of them, the one who'd once worked in a workshop, fixed the irrigation pump by hand. The sound of running water returned to the fields for the first time in 2 seasons. The one who rarely spoke filled the house with smells I hadn't known I'd missed. Onions sizzling, bread baking, herbs crushed between her palms. The quiet one spent hours among the books in my father's library, restoring torn pages, stacking volumes that had long since fallen from their shelves. I worked beside them because it would have felt wrong not to. At first, it was an act of duty. After all, they owed me, and I was the one keeping the ledger in my head. But the longer we worked together, the less I thought about debt. I started to listen. They talked sometimes while they worked, their words half stories, half memories. A city that had once glittered before it turned cruel. A mother who sang while hanging laundry. A garden behind a rented flat that had been taken away when the landlord sold the building. Their voices were soft but steady, threading through the sound of tools and footsteps. In the evenings, we would sit around the kitchen table, too tired to speak much. The house had grown warm again. The rain that drummed against the roof no longer sounded lonely. Sometimes one of them would hum, a low tune without words, and I'd feel something in me unclench that I hadn't realized was wound tight. Days folded into weeks. The estate began to look like a place someone could live in again. The walls smelled of paint instead of mildew, the windows shone, and the air carried traces of lavender and bread instead of the sharp scent of decay. They paid me back not in coins, but in the way they turned the place into a home. I caught myself laughing once, the kind of full, unguarded laugh I hadn't heard from my own throat in years. It startled all of us. They looked at me, then smiled, each of them in her own quiet way. It was then I realized that what they were restoring wasn't just the house. It was me. I had taken them in believing they would work off what they owed. Instead, each day I spent beside them felt like something I could never repay. The morning they left, the valley was wrapped in a pale mist that softened every sound. The world felt half asleep, and for a while I could pretend that nothing was about to change. The fields lay quiet, the trees heavy with fruit that hadn't grown here in years. The house stood solid, its paint still bright, its windows clear. Everything they had touched bore some trace of their care, the way a handprint lingers on glass even after it's gone invisible. They moved through the rooms without hurry, gathering the few things they had brought with them. There were no tears, no promises of letters or visits. They had come into my life like the storm that carried them here, sudden, fierce, and impossible to forget. Each of them paused before leaving, looking around as though memorizing the space, the light, the quiet. I stood by the doorway, unsure what to say that wouldn't sound small compared to what they had given. One of them left a carved bird on the table, wings outstretched, its surface sanded smooth by careful hands. Another handed me a folded scrap of paper, notes in tidy handwriting about how to prepare the soil for spring, when to prune the trees, when to rest the earth. The last gave nothing that could be held, only a look, steady and wordless, that said everything necessary. Then they stepped down the hill, their figures fading into the fog until the road swallowed them completely. Silence filled the house again, but it wasn't the same silence I'd known before. It was full, almost living. Their laughter still clung to the walls, their scent to the air. The wooden floors no longer creaked like old bones. They sounded alive under my feet. In the evenings, I'd catch myself setting 4 places at the table instead of 1. I'd find a stray hairpin on the mantel, a forgotten apron hanging by the door, a recipe scribbled in the margin of a book. They had become part of the place, stitched into its fabric. Through the months that followed, the seasons turned easily. The garden flourished, the fields yielded more than I'd expected, and I kept the windows open just to hear the wind pass through. Sometimes the wind carried a tune that sounded like their laughter. I learned to listen for it, not out of loneliness, but gratitude. They had come owing debts that could never truly be paid in money or labor. Yet what they gave me was worth more than either. They taught me to look at the world with hands ready to fix instead of fold, to see in every broken thing the promise of renewal. Their absence was not emptiness. It was a quiet proof that something lasting had been built between us. Years later, people who visited would remark on how warm the place felt, how alive it seemed, as though it remembered joy. I never told them why. I just smiled and let them believe it was the air, or the valley, or the way the sunlight hit the windows. But I knew better. The women I'd taken in had paid their debts long ago. What they left behind was a kind of wealth that could never be counted, only felt. A house that breathed, a life rebuilt, and the memory of 3 strangers who turned debt into grace.